For 50 years, Arthur Bell delivered letters to everyone in the village. Love letters, birthday cards, wedding invitations, and messages that changed lives forever. But in all those years, not one letter had ever been addressed to him, until his final morning as a postman. At the bottom of his mailbag, Arthur found a single cream-colored envelope. His name was written across the front. There was no stamp, no return address, and no one at the sorting office knew how it got there. But in the corner, 4 words had been written: "Deliver before sunset." There was only one problem. The letter was addressed to Arthur himself. Before we discover where that letter will lead, find a comfortable place to rest. Allow the sounds around you to become distant. Let your breathing become slow and easy. Tonight, we are traveling to a quiet English village, where old stone cottages line narrow streets, where autumn leaves gather beneath wooden benches, and where one ordinary postman is about to discover that a life can mean far more than the person living it ever realizes. So settle in, and come with me, to the village of Willowmere. Arthur Bell woke every morning at 5:30. He had done so for so many years that he no longer needed an alarm clock. Even on Sundays, his eyes usually opened at exactly the same time. 5:30. Never 5:29. Never 5:31. Arthur liked to believe his body had simply become another village clock. Reliable, quiet, and slightly old-fashioned. On this particular morning, he opened his eyes and listened. Rain tapped gently against the bedroom window. Not heavy rain, just the soft autumn kind. The kind that made the world outside seem quieter. Arthur remained beneath the blankets for a few moments. Today was different. After 50 years, this would be his final day as Willowmere's postman. Tomorrow morning, there would be no mailbag waiting by the door. No letters to sort. No familiar route to walk. For the first time since he was 19 years old, Arthur had nowhere he needed to be. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. He climbed slowly from bed, put on his slippers, and walked downstairs. His little cottage was exactly as it had been for years. A wooden clock ticked above the fireplace. A kettle waited beside the stove. His coat hung near the front door, and beside it, an empty hook waited for the old brown leather mailbag he had carried for decades. Arthur glanced at it. "Last one," he whispered. Then he smiled quietly to himself. He made tea. 1 spoonful of sugar. A small splash of milk. Exactly as he had made it every morning for as long as he could remember. Then he sat beside the kitchen window and watched the village slowly wake. Across the road, Mr. Fletcher opened the curtains of the bakery. A warm golden light appeared behind the glass. Soon, the smell of fresh bread would drift along the entire street. At number 12, Mrs. Whitmore's black cat appeared on a windowsill. The cat stared across the road at Arthur. Arthur raised his teacup. "Morning, Albert." The cat blinked once. Arthur considered that a perfectly acceptable reply. By 6:30, he was dressed. His dark blue uniform had been carefully pressed the night before. His shoes were polished. His cap sat neatly upon his silver hair. Arthur looked at himself in the hallway mirror. For a moment, he remembered the 19-year-old boy who had worn the uniform for the first time. The uniform had changed since then. So had the face wearing it. But the route, the village, and the simple responsibility of carrying something from one person to another had remained. Arthur picked up his coat and stepped into the rain. The Willowmere sorting office stood beside the railway station. It was a small brick building with tall windows and a green wooden door. Arthur had entered that door thousands of times, but this morning, when he pushed it open, everyone was waiting for him. Surprise! Arthur stopped. A small banner hung across the sorting room. "Happy retirement, Arthur." There was a cake on the table. Someone had placed 50 candles on it. Arthur stared at them. "Are you trying to celebrate my retirement or burn down the building?" The room filled with laughter. Arthur smiled. He had worked beside some of these people for decades. Others had joined only recently, but this morning, every one of them had arrived early. For him. There were handshakes. Warm embraces. Stories Arthur had forgotten. Someone remembered the winter he had delivered mail during the great snowstorm. Someone else remembered the time a dog chased him through 3 gardens. It was 2 gardens, Arthur corrected. 3. 2. The Henderson garden counts. That dog had no respect for property boundaries. More laughter. For a while. Arthur forgot to think about tomorrow. Eventually. The clock reached 7. And habit returned. The letters had to be delivered. One final time. Arthur walked toward his sorting table. His mailbag was already waiting. Filled and ready. He began checking the route. Mill Lane. Church Street. Rosewood Terrace. Station Road. Every address familiar. Every name known. Then, at the very bottom of the bag, his fingers touched something different. A single cream-colored envelope. Arthur removed it. The room around him seemed to grow quieter. On the front, written carefully in dark blue ink, was his name. Mr. Arthur Bell. Arthur frowned. One of his colleagues looked over. Everything all right? Arthur turned the envelope over. No return address. No postmark. No stamp. Nothing to explain where it had come from. Then he noticed the 4 small words written in the corner. Deliver before sunset. Arthur read them twice. Then a 3rd time. Who put this in my bag? No one answered. A few people looked at one another. Someone laughed. Maybe you've finally received some mail. Arthur smiled faintly, but something about the envelope held his attention. The paper was thick. Old-fashioned. And although he could not explain why, the handwriting felt strangely familiar. Not because he recognized it, but because it seemed to belong somewhere in his memory. Somewhere just beyond reach. Arthur considered opening it. His thumb slipped beneath the edge of the envelope. Then he stopped. Deliver before sunset. Not. Open before sunset. Deliver. A postman understood the difference. Arthur turned the envelope over again. There was no address. Only his name. How was he supposed to deliver a letter addressed to himself? And where? The clock above the sorting room ticked steadily. 7:15. Outside. The rain had softened. Arthur placed the mysterious envelope carefully inside the inner pocket of his coat. Whatever it meant, he still had a route to finish. And Arthur Bell had never left a route unfinished. Not once. Not in 50 years. He lifted the old leather mailbag onto his shoulder, adjusted his cap, and walked toward the green door. See you this evening, someone called. Arthur turned. Several of his colleagues were smiling strangely, almost as though they knew something he didn't. Arthur narrowed his eyes. What are you lot planning? Nothing. Arthur had delivered enough badly hidden birthday cards to recognize a lie. But he smiled, opened the door, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. Willowmere glistened beneath a pale autumn sky. Water rested on the cobblestones. Golden leaves clung to the pavement. Smoke curled gently from old brick chimneys. From the bakery, the smell of fresh bread drifted into the cool morning air. Arthur took a slow breath, then began walking. His final route. The first letter went to number 4, Mill Lane. Mrs. Evelyn Hart. Arthur had delivered letters to that house for 43 years. He remembered when Evelyn first moved there. Young. Newly married. Nervous about living so far from her family. 4 months. Letters arrived every Tuesday from her mother. Arthur had never read them, of course. But he remembered how Evelyn always waited by the window. This morning, she was waiting again. The door opened before Arthur reached the gate. You're late. Arthur checked his watch. By 40 seconds. Unacceptable. I'll try to improve tomorrow. Evelyn smiled. Then both of them remembered. There would be no tomorrow. Not like this. Her smile softened. Arthur handed her 2 letters. She took them slowly. Then looked at him. 50 years. So they tell me. Willowmere won't be the same. Arthur looked down at his shoes. He had never been particularly comfortable with goodbyes. Someone younger will come along. That isn't what I said. Arthur looked back at her. For a moment. Neither spoke. Then Evelyn reached forward and hugged him. A brief, warm, unexpected embrace. Thank you, Arthur. For what? But Evelyn had already stepped back. You'll understand. Before Arthur could ask what she meant, she smiled and closed the door. Arthur stood at the gate. You'll understand. The words remained with him. Then, inside his coat, he felt the edge of the mysterious envelope. He removed it again. Mr. Arthur Bell. Deliver before sunset. For the first time that morning, Arthur wondered whether the letter, and the strange behavior of everyone around him, were connected. He looked toward the road ahead. 47 houses remained on his final route. And somewhere among them, Arthur had the growing feeling, an answer was waiting. So he returned the envelope to his pocket, adjusted the old leather bag upon his shoulder, and continued walking through the quiet autumn streets of Willowmere. One final delivery at a time, Arthur continued along Mill Lane. The village was fully awake now. Curtains opened behind cottage windows. Shopkeepers swept rainwater from their doorsteps. Somewhere nearby, a radio played softly through an open kitchen window. And with every few steps, Arthur felt the cream-colored envelope resting against his chest. He tried not to think about it. This proved impossible. For 50 years, Arthur had carried other people's mysteries, sealed inside envelopes, protected by glue and paper. He had never asked what they contained. A postman's job was not to know. It was simply to deliver. But now, for the first time, the mystery belonged to him. His next stop was the village bakery. The bell above the door gave its familiar little ring as Arthur entered. Warmth immediately surrounded him. The windows were misted with steam. Fresh loaves rested in neat rows behind the counter. Cinnamon, butter, warm bread. The familiar scents filled the small room. Mr. Fletcher appeared from the kitchen with flour on his apron. Arthur. Morning, Samuel. Arthur reached into his bag. 3 letters and a bill. Samuel frowned. On your last day? I considered losing the bill. And professional standards. Samuel laughed. Terrible habit. Arthur handed him the post. But instead of taking it and returning to the kitchen, Samuel remained beside the counter. Do you remember my first morning here? Arthur thought for a moment. September. 41 years ago. Raining. Terribly. You burned the first batch of bread. Samuel stared at him. How do you remember that? Arthur shrugged. The entire village could smell it. They both laughed. Samuel looked toward the old bakery windows. I almost left that morning. Arthur's smile faded slightly. What? I hadn't told anyone. Samuel rested both hands on the counter. I'd spent everything I had buying this place. Then I ruined the first batch, the oven wasn't working properly, and there were no customers. He smiled faintly. I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Arthur listened. Then you arrived. With the post. With a postcard. Arthur searched his memory. Samuel continued. My brother had sent it from Manchester. Just 5 words. Samuel looked at Arthur. He wrote, give it one more day. The bakery became quiet. I stayed. Arthur glanced around the room. At the shelves of bread. The warm lights. The photographs of Samuel's children and grandchildren hanging behind the counter. Good advice, Arthur said. It was. Samuel smiled. But that's not the part one remember most. Arthur raised an eyebrow. You stood right there, dripping rainwater all over my floor. I apologized for that. You did not. I probably meant to. Samuel laughed. Then his expression softened. You bought my first loaf. Arthur stared at him. I did. You said you were hungry. I probably was. No. Samuel shook his head. The bread was terrible. Arthur smiled. It wasn't that bad. It could have been used to repair a wall. Arthur laughed. Samuel reached beneath the counter. He placed a small paper bag in front of him. Your usual. Arthur looked inside. A warm currant bun. I haven't paid. You paid 41 years ago. Arthur opened his mouth to argue. Samuel pointed toward the door. Go. Arthur smiled. Thank you, Samuel. No. Samuel's voice was quieter now. Thank you, Arthur. Arthur stepped back outside. The paper bag was warm in his hand. For several moments, he stood beneath the bakery awning while a few drops of rain fell from the roof. He could barely remember buying that loaf. To Arthur, it had been nothing. A hungry young postman buying breakfast. Yet Samuel had remembered it for 41 years. Arthur looked down at the paper bag. Then at the cream envelope hidden inside his coat. You'll understand. Evelyn's words returned. Arthur continued walking. At the end of Mill Lane stood a small red postbox. Arthur had emptied it thousands of times. Today, he opened it for the last time. Inside were 7 letters. A birthday card. 2 business envelopes. A postcard. And 3 handwritten letters. Arthur placed them carefully inside his bag. As he closed the little metal door, he rested his hand against the red paint. For just a moment. Then moved on. His route led him toward Rosewood Terrace. The houses here were smaller. Their gardens crowded with late autumn flowers. At number 18, a young boy was waiting at the gate. His name was Daniel. 8 years old. Missing one front tooth. And wearing yellow rain boots despite the fact that the rain had stopped. Mr. Bell. Arthur smiled. Mr. Carter. Daniel liked being addressed formally. It made him stand a little taller. Do you have anything for me? Arthur searched his bag with exaggerated seriousness. Daniel watched eagerly. Electricity bill. No. Garden catalogue. No. Letter from the king. Daniel's eyes widened. Arthur paused. No. Sorry. Wrong Daniel. The boy laughed. Finally, Arthur produced a postcard. Daniel grabbed it excitedly. My dad sent it. His father worked aboard a cargo ship and spent months away from home. Every few weeks, a postcard arrived from somewhere new. Lisbon. Cape Town. Singapore. Places Daniel had only seen on maps. He turned the postcard over immediately, then stopped. Can you read it? Arthur looked at him. Your mother isn't home. She's upstairs with the baby. Arthur hesitated, then crouched beside the gate. Daniel handed him the postcard. Arthur read slowly. Dear Daniel, I saw dolphins beside the ship yesterday and thought of you. I'll tell you everything when I come home. Keep looking after your mum. And don't forget to feed Chester. Love, Dad. Daniel smiled. Chester is my fish. I assumed Chester was a very small, quiet dog. Daniel laughed. Then carefully held the postcard against his chest. Mr. Bell? Yes. Who will bring my dad's postcards now? Arthur looked at the boy. The new postman. Will he read them? Arthur smiled. If you ask nicely. Daniel considered this. Then nodded. Okay. Arthur stood. As he turned to leave, Daniel called after him. Mr. Bell? Arthur looked back. I think you were the best one. Arthur swallowed. The best what? Postman. Daniel disappeared through the gate before Arthur could answer. Arthur continued walking, but a little more slowly now. Something strange was happening. Not with the letter. With the village. Or perhaps, with Arthur himself. For 50 years. He had measured his days in addresses. Number 4. Number 18. Number 32. A letter delivered. A parcel signed for. A gate opened. A gate closed. Then onward to the next house. He had rarely stopped to consider what happened after he left. But today, people kept handing those moments back to him. Moments he had forgotten. Moments they had not. By 11 o'clock, the clouds had begun to break. Soft sunlight appeared between them. The wet streets shimmered. Arthur reached St. Mary's Lane. At the corner stood an old stone cottage covered in climbing ivy. He stopped. There was no letter for this house. There hadn't been for years. But for almost 3 decades. Arthur had delivered mail here to a woman named Margaret Bell, his wife. Arthur stood outside the gate. The cottage belonged to someone else now. A young family. There were children's bicycles beside the wall. Bright curtains in the windows. A wooden swing beneath the apple tree. Arthur smiled faintly. Margaret would have liked that. She had always believed houses should be noisy. Their own cottage had never been blessed with children. For many years. They had hoped. Then, slowly, they had learned to build a happy life from the things they did have. Sunday walks. Books beside the fire. Tea in the garden. Arguments about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. 42 years together. Then one quiet winter. Arthur had continued his route alone. He had received many sympathy cards after Margaret died. They were the last letters ever delivered to Arthur Bell. But technically, they had not arrived in his mailbag. His colleagues had brought them to his house. Arthur suddenly thought of the envelope inside his coat. Perhaps he had been wrong. It wasn't the first letter ever addressed to him. But it was the first one he had ever found among the letters he was meant to deliver. And somehow, that made it different. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Bell? Arthur turned. A young woman stood at the cottage gate. The new owner. Are you all right? Yes. Arthur smiled. Just remembering. She looked toward the house. Then seemed to understand. Would you like to come in? Arthur shook his head gently. No, thank you. He looked toward the apple tree. Take care of that tree. The woman smiled. We will. Arthur nodded. Then continued down the lane. At the end of the road. He finally stopped. He reached inside his coat. Removed the cream envelope. And studied it again. The handwriting. There was something about the letter M in his name. The long curve. The small upward stroke. Arthur's heart gave a quiet, unexpected beat. Margaret had written her MS like that. He looked closer. No. It couldn't be. The rest of the handwriting was different. Wasn't it? Arthur suddenly felt foolish. After all these years. Memory could make familiar shapes out of almost anything. He returned the envelope to his coat. But this time. His hands were not quite as steady. By midday, Arthur had completed half his route. He sat on his usual bench beside the village pond. Ducks moved lazily across the water. Autumn leaves floated on the surface. Arthur opened the paper bag Samuel had given him. The currant bun was still slightly warm. He took a bite. Much better than Samuel's first loaf. Across the pond. The church clock struck 12. Arthur looked toward the pale autumn sun. Sunset would come shortly after 5. 5 hours. Deliver before sunset. But deliver it where? Arthur removed the envelope again. For the first time. He held it toward the sunlight. Something was inside besides a letter. Something small. Something with a hard edge. Arthur gently moved the envelope between his fingers. A key. There was definitely a key inside. Arthur sat very still. A letter. And a key. He turned the envelope over. That was when he noticed something he had missed before. Along the bottom edge. Almost hidden beneath the fold. Someone had written another line in tiny blue letters. Arthur brought the envelope closer. He read the words slowly. Your final delivery begins where your first one ended. Arthur stared at the sentence. Once. Twice. Then the memory returned. His first day. 50 years ago. 19 years old. Terrified of making a mistake. His final delivery that afternoon had been to a house at the very edge of Willowmere. A small white cottage beyond the old railway bridge. Arthur had not walked that road in years. The cottage had been empty for as long as he could remember. But he knew exactly where it was. Arthur slowly stood. His lunch forgotten. His ordinary route continued toward Church Street. But the mysterious letter. was pointing somewhere else. Toward the edge of the village. Toward a house from his very first day as a postman. Arthur looked in one direction, then the other. For 50 years. He had never abandoned his route. And today would be no different. He placed the envelope carefully back inside his coat. There were still letters to deliver. Still doors to visit. Still goodbyes waiting along the way. But now, Arthur finally knew where he had to be before sunset. The old white cottage beyond the railway bridge. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the thought of that forgotten house made him remember a promise he had made almost 50 years ago. A promise he had completely forgotten. Until now, Arthur remained beside the village pond for another moment. The words on the envelope seemed to grow heavier in his hands. Your final delivery begins where your first one ended. The old white cottage. Beyond the railway bridge. And a promise he could no longer quite remember. Arthur placed the envelope carefully inside his coat. Then looked at his watch. 12:15. There was still time. His route came first. It always had. So he lifted the mailbag onto his shoulder. And continued toward Church Street. The bells of St. Mary's Church rang softly as Arthur approached. Church Street was one of the oldest parts of Willowmere. Stone cottages leaned toward the narrow road. Small gardens rested behind low walls. And at the very end of the street stood the village school. Arthur had delivered letters there for almost as long as he could remember. Today, there was only one. He pushed open the little iron gate. Before he reached the front door, it opened. 23 children stood inside. Completely silent. Arthur stopped. That alone was suspicious. In 50 years, Arthur had never known 23 children to remain silent at the same time. Their teacher, Miss Collins, stood behind them. She was trying not to smile. Arthur looked from one face to another. Have I interrupted something? No, said Miss Collins. Arthur narrowed his eyes. Are you certain? Quite certain. One of the children giggled. Then another. Arthur reached into his bag. I have a letter for the school. Miss Collins took it. But no one moved. Arthur waited. The children waited. Finally, Arthur said, well. 23 voices suddenly shouted. Thank you, Mr. Bell. Arthur jumped. The children burst into laughter. Then they stepped aside. Behind them, the wall was covered with drawings. Dozens of them. Pictures of Arthur. Or at least, pictures that were apparently meant to be Arthur. In one drawing, his mailbag was larger than his entire body. In another, he had bright green hair. One child had drawn him flying through the sky with letters falling behind him. Arthur stared. Is that supposed to be me? A little girl nodded proudly. You have superpowers. I see. You deliver everything. Arthur looked at the picture again. I'll have to speak with the post office about the flying. The children laughed. Miss Collins stepped closer. They wanted to make something for your last day. Arthur looked across the wall. At the crooked houses. The enormous post boxes. The badly drawn bicycles. The little blue figures carrying letters through rain and snow. Something tightened gently in his chest. These are very good. They're not, said a boy near the back. Miss Collins looked at him. The boy quickly added. Mine is. Arthur laughed. Then a small girl approached him. She held out a folded piece of paper. This is for you. Arthur looked at it. Another letter? She nodded. Arthur hesitated. Then accepted it. On the front, in large uneven handwriting, were the words. To Mr. Bell. Arthur opened it. Inside was one sentence. Thank you for bringing my birthday card from my grandma because she lives far away and I miss her. Arthur read it twice. Then carefully folded the paper. Thank you. The girl smiled. Arthur placed it inside his coat. Beside the mysterious cream envelope. For the first time that day, he was carrying 2 letters addressed to him. As Arthur left the school, he heard the children calling goodbye through the windows. He raised one hand without turning around. The autumn sun had grown warmer. The clouds were thinning. And somewhere above the rooftops, a flock of birds crossed the pale blue sky. Arthur continued his route. But now, every street seemed different. Not because the village had changed, because he was finally looking at it. Really looking. At number 27. Mrs. Green gave him a jar of homemade marmalade. At number 31. Mr. and Mrs. Davies insisted on taking a photograph with him. At number 38. A woman Arthur had known since she was a child reminded him that he had once found her lost dog. Arthur had no memory of this. You found him behind the butcher's shop. Did I? You carried him home. That doesn't sound like me. He was covered in mud. That definitely doesn't sound like me. She laughed. Then showed him an old photograph. A much younger Arthur stood beside a little girl. In his arms was a muddy dog. Arthur stared at the picture. There he was. 25 years younger. Looking deeply unhappy about the condition of his uniform. Arthur smiled. I remember the mud. By 2 o'clock. The mailbag was noticeably lighter. But Arthur's pockets were becoming heavier. A jar of marmalade. 3 cards. A small packet of biscuits. 2 drawings. And a knitted scarf that Mrs. Parker had apparently spent 6 months making. Arthur had tried to refuse some of the gifts. No one had allowed him. The village seemed determined to make his final route as difficult to carry as possible. Yet, with every stop, the mysterious letter remained in his thoughts. The old cottage. The key inside the envelope. And the forgotten promise. At 2:30, Arthur reached Rosewood Bridge. Beneath it, the railway tracks disappeared toward the distant hills. Arthur stopped. The road to the old white cottage began on the other side. He could see it from where he stood. A narrow lane bordered by tall trees. Golden leaves covered the ground. Beyond those trees, somewhere out of sight, stood the place where his first route had ended 50 years ago. Arthur checked his watch, then looked inside his mailbag. 7 deliveries remained. He turned away from the bridge. Not yet. His next stop was Willowmere House, a small care home near the church. Arthur entered through the front door. The receptionist smiled when she saw him. They're waiting. Arthur sighed. Does everyone in this village know something I don't? The receptionist only smiled. Apparently. She led him into the sitting room. 6 elderly residents were gathered near the fireplace. Among them sat a man Arthur recognized immediately. Thomas Reed. 91 years old. Retired railway worker. And, many decades ago, Arthur's first supervisor at the sorting office. Bell. Arthur smiled. Mr. Reed. I'm retired. You can call me Thomas. I've been waiting 50 years for permission. Thomas laughed. Sit down. Arthur glanced at his watch. 5 minutes. You always were obsessed with time. You trained me. Poorly, apparently. Arthur Saturday. Thomas studied him for a moment. Last day. Yes. Didn't think you'd make it. Arthur raised an eyebrow. You told me I'd quit within a month. You were terrible. I was 19. You delivered Mrs. Baker's letter to Mrs. Barker. Once. Twice. Arthur smiled. 1.5. Thomas laughed. Then his expression changed. Do you remember your first route? Arthur's smile slowly disappeared. The envelope seemed to press against his chest. Some of it. Do you remember the last house? Arthur looked at him. The white cottage beyond the railway bridge. Thomas nodded. Arthur leaned forward. Who lived there? Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he said, Mr. and Mrs. Vale. The name stirred something. A room. A doorway. A woman's voice. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Vale. Thomas watched him carefully. You really don't remember? Not clearly. You delivered a letter there on your first day. Arthur waited. Thomas continued. It had been delayed. Why? Wrong sorting office. It had traveled halfway around the county before reaching us. Arthur frowned. And? You were worried. About what? That you'd be late. Arthur almost smiled. That sounded like him. Thomas looked toward the fire. I told you the route was finished. The letter could wait until morning. Arthur said nothing. But you refused. A fragment of memory returned. Rain. A bicycle. A letter protected beneath his coat. Arthur's heart began to beat faster. I went anyway. Thomas nodded. 6 miles in the rain. Arthur looked toward the window. And the promise? Thomas turned back to him. What promise? Arthur removed the cream envelope. Thomas stared at it. Arthur showed him the words along the bottom. Your final delivery begins where your first one ended. Thomas read them. His expression became impossible to understand. Where did you get this? It was in my bag. Thomas looked at Arthur. Then at the envelope. Have you opened it? No. Why not? It says deliver before sunset. Thomas smiled faintly, still following instructions. Someone has to. But Thomas did not laugh. Instead, he looked toward the clock. 3:15. You should finish your route. Arthur studied him. You know something. Thomas looked back at him. I know you shouldn't be late. Thomas. Finish your route, Arthur. There was something in the old man's voice. Something that made Arthur stop asking questions. He slowly returned the envelope to his coat. Then stood. At the door. Thomas called his name. Arthur turned. The old man smiled. You were never terrible. Arthur waited. Thomas continued. Not after the first week. Arthur laughed softly. High praise. The highest. By 4 o'clock. Arthur had only one letter left. One ordinary white envelope. Addressed to number 7, Station Road. He walked slowly toward the house. The afternoon sun had begun its descent. Long shadows stretched across the village. The air had become cooler. Arthur approached the final gate. For 50 years. There had always been another letter. Another house. Another street. But now. There was only one. Arthur walked to the front door. He raised his hand. And knocked. A young woman answered. Arthur recognized her. Lucy Morgan. She had moved to Willowmere only 6 months earlier. Good afternoon. Mr. Bell. Arthur reached into his bag. Then stopped. He looked at the envelope in his hand. The last ordinary letter of his career. Such a small thing. He had imagined this moment before. He had expected it to feel important. Ceremonial, perhaps. Instead, it felt exactly like every other delivery. And somehow, that made it more meaningful. Arthur held out the envelope. One for you. Lucy smiled and took it. Thank you. 2 ordinary words. The same words he had heard thousands of times. Arthur nodded. My pleasure. Then he turned away. His mailbag was empty. Arthur stood at the gate. He looked inside the old leather bag. Nothing. For the first time in 50 years. Arthur Bell had no letters left to deliver. Then he remembered. That wasn't true. There was still one. Arthur reached inside his coat. The cream envelope waited. Mr. Arthur Bell. Deliver before sunset. He looked toward the western sky. The sun was already sinking. Arthur checked his watch. 4:23. Then he began walking toward the railway bridge. The village slowly fell behind him. The bakery. The school. The church. The streets he had walked for half a century. Arthur crossed the bridge. And entered the narrow lane beyond it. The trees grew taller here. Their branches formed a golden canopy overhead. Leaves moved softly beneath his shoes. The road was quiet. Almost forgotten. With every step. More fragments of his first day returned. Rain against his face. A heavy mailbag. A borrowed bicycle. A young man desperate not to fail. And a letter. One letter. The final delivery of his first day. Then Arthur remembered the door. A woman had opened it. She had looked at the envelope. Then at him. And she had begun to cry. Not from sadness. From relief. Arthur stopped walking. The memory was clearer now. The letter had come from someone far away. Someone the woman had believed was lost. Arthur could almost hear her voice. You brought him home. But that wasn't possible. Arthur had only brought a letter. Then, another memory. The woman standing at the gate as he prepared to leave. Rain falling around them. Her hand resting on his arm. And her words. If you ever need reminding that what you carry matters, come back. Arthur stood completely still. The promise. He remembered now. He had smiled. Young. Embarrassed. Certain he would remember forever. And he had said, I will. But he never had. Not once. In 50 years. Arthur looked ahead. At the end of the lane. Between the trees. The old white cottage appeared. It wasn't empty. A warm light glowed behind one window. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. And the front door was open. Arthur's heart began to pound. He checked the envelope. Then the sinking sun. And slowly, he walked toward the house. As he reached the gate, he noticed something hanging beside it. An old wooden sign. The paint was faded, but the words were still visible. Arthur leaned closer and read them. Post for Arthur Bell. Beneath the sign stood a wooden box, filled with letters. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Every single envelope addressed to him. Arthur stood at the gate, unable to move. Post for Arthur Bell. Beneath those words sat a wooden box overflowing with letters. Cream envelopes, white envelopes, birthday cards, postcards. Some new, some yellowed with age. Arthur slowly opened the gate. It gave a quiet creak. Then he approached the box. The first envelope simply read, Arthur. The second, for Mr. Bell. The third, to the postman who never knew. Arthur stared at them. There had to be hundreds. Letters addressed to him. Letters he had never received. Letters that had somehow been waiting here. At the end of the route where everything had begun. You're late. Arthur froze. The voice came from the open doorway. An elderly woman stood there. She was small, wrapped in a soft grey cardigan, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her head. Arthur looked at her. For a moment, he saw another woman, younger, standing in the rain 50 years ago, holding a letter against her chest. His breath caught. Mrs. Vale? The woman smiled. My mother. Arthur said nothing. I'm Clara. Arthur remembered the name. The letter. The one he had delivered all those years ago. Your father. Clara nodded. Was alive. The memory returned completely. The delayed letter had come from a hospital overseas. Mr. Vale had been injured while working abroad. For weeks. His family had heard nothing. Then the letter arrived. Late. Misrouted. But carrying the words they had been waiting for. I am alive. Arthur looked toward the cottage. I remember. Clara smiled. My mother always said you would. Arthur touched the cream envelope inside his coat. Did you put this in my mailbag? Clara looked at it. Part of it was my idea. Part. You'll understand. Arthur almost laughed. Everyone keeps saying that. Then perhaps it's time you did. She stepped aside. Come in, Arthur. Arthur looked at the sinking sun. Then at the box of letters. I was told to make a delivery. Clara smiled. And you have. Arthur frowned. What did I deliver? Yourself. The cottage was warm. A fire burned softly in the sitting room. The furniture was old but carefully kept. On the walls hung photographs spanning generations. Arthur recognized Mrs. Vale in several of them. In one photograph, she stood beside a man Arthur assumed was her husband. Older. Smiling. Alive. Arthur stared at the picture. He came home. 6 months after your first delivery. Clara stood beside him. They had another 27 years together. Arthur looked at her. 27 years. All hidden behind one letter he had carried through the rain. Clara walked toward a wooden table. On it rested a large leather-bound book. She opened it. Inside were names. Hundreds of them. Beside each name, a date. Arthur recognized many. Evelyn Hart, Samuel Fletcher, Thomas Reed. Teachers, shopkeepers, families, people he had known all his life. What is this? Clara smiled. The people who wrote to you. Arthur looked toward the box outside. I don't understand. My mother started it. When? 49 years ago. Arthur stared at her. Clara turned another page. My mother never forgot the young postman who cycled 6 miles through the rain because he refused to leave one letter until morning. Arthur looked down. I was doing my job. That is what she said you would say. Clara smiled. Every year, my mother wrote you a letter. Arthur's eyes moved toward the box. Why didn't she send them? She wanted to. Clara paused. But then she had an idea. Arthur waited. She began asking other people if there was something they had never thanked you for. Arthur frowned. Me? You would be surprised. Clara turned another page. At first, there were 7 letters. The following year, 12. Then 23. People moved away and mailed theirs back to Willowmere. Children grew up and wrote their own. Some people wrote more than once. Arthur looked toward the window. At the wooden box outside. Why keep them here? Because my mother remembered your promise. Arthur closed his eyes. If you ever need reminding that what you carry matters, come back. Clara continued softly. She believed one day you would. But I didn't. No. Arthur looked down. I forgot. Clara smiled. Then we decided to remind you. Arthur removed the cream envelope. The handwriting. My mother's. Arthur's eyes lifted. She wrote your name on that envelope 11 years ago. Arthur stared at it. 11 years. Before she died. The room became very quiet. Clara's voice softened. She knew she might not be here when you retired. Arthur ran his thumb gently across his name. The strange familiarity. The curved letters. The memory he had almost recognized. What's inside? Clara looked toward the clock. 4:58. Open it. Arthur looked at the envelope. For the entire day. He had resisted. Now. Slowly. He broke the seal. Inside was a small brass key. And a folded sheet of paper. Arthur opened it. The handwriting was the same. Older than he remembered. But unmistakable now. He began to read. Dear Arthur. If you are reading this, then you finally came back. Arthur smiled faintly. You once believed you brought one letter to my door. You were wrong. Arthur's smile disappeared. You brought me 27 more years with my husband. You brought my daughter her father home. You brought birthdays, Christmas mornings, ordinary Tuesdays, arguments, laughter, and thousands of moments that would not have existed in quite the same way without the hope inside that envelope. Arthur stopped reading. The fire crackled softly. Clara stood silently beside him. Arthur continued. I know you will say you only delivered a letter. A quiet laugh escaped him. Clara smiled. That is why I asked the village to write to you. Because for 50 years, you have stood briefly at the edges of thousands of lives without ever seeing what happened after the door closed. Arthur's eyes blurred. He blinked. Then continued. Every letter in that box is a door you once knocked upon. Every person behind those doors remembers something you have forgotten. Today, Arthur, your final delivery is not a letter. It is 50 years of your life, returned to you. Arthur lowered the page. For a long moment. He said nothing. Clara placed the leather-bound book in front of him. The key opens the box. Arthur looked at the small brass key in his hand. Then toward the window. The sun was touching the horizon. Before sunset, he whispered. Clara nodded. Arthur stood. Together. They walked outside. The evening air was cool. Golden light moved between the trees. Arthur approached the wooden box. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Arthur lifted the lid fully. Hundreds of letters waited inside. He reached for the first. It was old. The envelope had yellowed around the edges. The date was nearly 40 years earlier. Arthur opened it. "Dear Mr. Bell. You probably don't remember me." Arthur smiled. Apparently, this was going to be a common beginning. "When I was 9 years old, my father worked overseas. Every month, you brought me his letters. I used to wait for you at the gate. One winter, no letter came." Arthur's smile faded. "You saw me waiting anyway. The next morning, you stopped and told me that sometimes letters were late, but late did not mean forgotten." Arthur remembered. A little boy. A red scarf. Snow on a garden wall. My father's letter arrived 3 days later. "I have remembered your words all my life. Late does not mean forgotten." Arthur lowered the letter. He could not remember the boy's name. But the boy, wherever he was now, had remembered Arthur. He opened another. From a woman who thanked him for carrying groceries into her mother's house during a storm. Arthur had forgotten. Another. From a man who remembered Arthur delivering his university acceptance letter. Another. From a woman whose husband had proposed through a letter Arthur delivered. Another. From a soldier who said Arthur had carried his letters home while he was away. One after another. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Things Arthur had done without thinking. Returned to him. Decades later. Then he found a familiar handwriting. Margaret. Arthur stopped breathing for a moment. The envelope simply read, "For Arthur, when he finally has time to sit still." His wife. Arthur looked at Clara. "How?" Clara smiled gently. "Margaret knew about the box." Arthur stared at her. "She came here?" "Many times." Arthur looked down at the envelope. "She never told me. She said you were impossible to surprise." Arthur laughed through the sudden ache in his chest. Apparently not. He sat on the wooden bench beside the cottage. The sun was almost gone now. Arthur opened Margaret's letter. "My dear Arthur. If you are reading this, then someone has finally managed to make you stop walking." Arthur smiled. "I have spent most of my life watching you leave the house carrying a bag full of other people's words. And every evening, you returned believing you had simply done your job. You never understood what the village saw." Arthur swallowed. They saw the man who remembered which old people needed an extra minute at the door. The man who knew which children were waiting for postcards from fathers far away. The man who walked through rain, snow, and summer heat because somewhere, someone might be waiting. Arthur looked toward the village in the distance. Lights were beginning to appear in the windows. "You once told me you were only a postman. You were never only anything, Arthur." The words blurred. Arthur closed his eyes. For a moment. He could almost hear Margaret reading them beside him. Then he continued. "When your final day comes, I hope you finally understand something I have always known. A life does not have to be loud to matter. Sometimes, a good life is simply built by showing up. Day after day. Door after door. Year after year. And if I am not beside you when you read this." Arthur stopped. The evening became completely still. Then he read the final lines. "Know that loving you was the easiest journey of my life. Now go home, Arthur. For once, let someone else carry the bag. Love always. Margaret." Arthur sat beneath the old trees, holding the letter in both hands. The sun disappeared beyond the hills. He had made the delivery before sunset. But for the first time in 50 years, Arthur understood that the final letter had never really needed to be delivered to a place. It had needed to reach him. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, Arthur heard voices. Many voices. He looked toward the lane. Warm lights appeared in the distance. One by one. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Moving toward the cottage. Arthur stood. At the front of the group was Samuel from the bakery. Beside him walked Evelyn. Miss Collins. Daniel in his yellow rain boots. His colleagues from the sorting office. Thomas Reed was being pushed carefully in a wheelchair. Behind them came the people of Willowmere. Arthur stared. Clara smiled beside him. "Did you really think they were going to let you spend your final evening alone?" Arthur looked at the hundreds of letters. Then at the people walking toward him. For 50 years. Arthur Bell had carried the village's messages. Tonight. The village had come to deliver one of its own. And this time. Arthur was finally there to receive it. The people of Willowmere continued along the narrow lane. Lanterns glowed beneath the trees. Their warm light moved gently across the fallen leaves. Arthur stood beside the old white cottage, watching them come closer. For 50 years. He had walked toward their doors. Tonight. They were walking toward his. Samuel arrived first. He carried a large basket covered with a white cloth. I brought food. Arthur looked at the basket. For all these people. Samuel smiled. No. That's yours. Arthur stared at him. What am I supposed to do with an entire basket of bread? Retire. I don't think that's how retirement works. You'll learn. Behind Samuel came Evelyn. Then Miss Collins and several of the children's parents. Daniel hurried ahead in his yellow rain boots. Mr. Bell. Arthur smiled. Mr. Carter. Daniel stopped in front of him. Did you find your letter? Arthur looked down at the boy. So. Daniel had known too. You knew about this. Daniel grinned. Arthur looked around at the gathering crowd. Did everyone know? A few people laughed. Arthur shook his head. 50 years carrying this village's secrets. He looked at the hundreds of letters behind him. And apparently, none of you trusted me with this one. Exactly, Samuel said. More people arrived. Some Arthur recognized immediately. Others took him a moment. People who had moved away from Willowmere years before had returned. A woman approached with her teenage daughter. Arthur stared at her. Emily. She smiled. You remember me. You broke Mrs. Parker's window with a cricket ball. Emily laughed. I was 7. You blamed your brother. He deserved it. He wasn't there. Details. Arthur laughed. Then Emily hugged him. Over her shoulder. Arthur saw more familiar faces. Children who were no longer children. Young couples who had grown old together. People whose names had disappeared from his route years ago. Yet somehow, they had remembered his. No speeches had been planned. Arthur was grateful for that. He had never liked standing at the center of a room. Or a garden. Or anywhere, really. Instead, people simply stayed. They ate warm bread. Drank tea. Shared stories. And as the evening grew darker, Arthur listened. Do you remember the parcel you carried all the way into my kitchen because I had hurt my back? No. Arthur didn't. Do you remember finding my house when the snow covered every road sign? Barely. Do you remember waiting while I found my glasses because I couldn't see where to sign? Arthur smiled. That one. Yes. He remembered. But for every story he recalled, there were 10 he had forgotten. And slowly, Arthur began to understand. Perhaps that was the strange thing about kindness. The person giving it might carry the moment for only a minute. But the person receiving it might carry it for years. Later that evening, Thomas Reed called Arthur over. The old man sat beneath a blanket near the fire. You made it. Arthur sat beside him. Apparently. Thomas nodded toward the box of letters. Quite a collection. Did you write one? Thomas looked offended. Of course not. Arthur smiled. Good. I wrote 3. Arthur laughed. Thomas leaned back in his chair. The first one was mostly complaints. I expected nothing less. The second was slightly kinder. And the third? Thomas looked at him. The third said I was wrong. Arthur became quiet. About what? Thomas smiled. When you were 19, I thought you'd last a month. Arthur looked toward the lanterns. And instead, 50 years. Thomas nodded slowly. Not bad, Bell. Arthur smiled. High praise. The highest. By 9 o'clock, families began making their way home. One by one, the lanterns disappeared down the lane. Goodbyes were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Arthur received more hugs than he had received in the previous decade. Eventually, the cottage became quiet again. Clara stood beside the wooden box. How are you going to carry all of these? Arthur looked at the letters. Then at his old leather mailbag. For 50 years. That bag had carried letters away from him. Tonight. Arthur began filling it with letters meant for him. When the bag was full, Samuel took the box. I'll drive the rest. Arthur opened his mouth. No arguments, Samuel said. Arthur closed it again. Retirement, he was beginning to discover, involved a surprising loss of authority. Before leaving, Arthur turned toward Clara. I don't know how to thank you. Clara smiled. You already did. When? 50 years ago. Arthur looked back at the old white cottage. At the window where warm light still glowed. At the gate he had once walked through as a nervous 19-year-old. Carrying one delayed letter through the rain. He had believed that day was ordinary. Just another delivery. Just another envelope. But perhaps there were no ordinary days. Not really. Only days whose meaning had not yet revealed itself. Arthur walked home beneath a clear autumn sky. For the first time in 50 years. His mailbag was filled with letters he was not required to deliver. There was no deadline. No route. No address waiting ahead. He could read them tonight. Tomorrow. Next week. For once. The letters could wait for him. When Arthur reached his cottage, Samuel had already left the wooden box beside the fireplace. Arthur removed his cap, hung his coat by the door, then placed the old leather mailbag on its usual hook. He stopped. Tomorrow. It would still be there. Empty. The thought no longer frightened him quite as much. Arthur made tea. 1 spoonful of sugar. A small splash of milk. Then he sat in his favorite chair. The cottage was quiet. But it did not feel empty. Not tonight. On the table beside him, hundreds of letters waited. Arthur reached for one. Then stopped. His eyes moved toward Margaret's letter. He picked it up instead. And read the final lines once more. A life does not have to be loud to matter. Sometimes, a good life is simply built by showing up. Day after day. Door after door. Year after year. Arthur smiled. Good night, Margaret. The fire crackled softly. Outside. Willowmere slept. And for the first time in 50 years, Arthur went to bed without checking the weather for the morning. At exactly 5:30, Arthur opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling. For several seconds. He couldn't understand what was wrong. Then he remembered. Nothing was wrong. He simply had nowhere he needed to be. Arthur closed his eyes again. 5:32. He opened them. This is ridiculous. He climbed out of bed. Apparently, 50 years of habit could not be retired overnight. He went downstairs. Made tea. 1 spoonful of sugar. A small splash of milk. Then sat beside the kitchen window. Across the road, Mr. Fletcher opened the bakery curtains. At number 12, Albert the black cat appeared on the windowsill. Arthur raised his cup. Morning, Albert. The cat blinked. Some things, Arthur thought, did not need to change. Then, there was a knock at the door. Arthur frowned. It was barely 6:30. He opened it. Daniel stood outside. Yellow rain boots. Messy hair. And a small canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. Arthur looked at the bag. Then at Daniel. What are you doing? Daniel reached inside. He removed a single envelope. I have a delivery. Arthur stared at him. Daniel held out the letter. On the front, in large uneven handwriting, were the words, Mr. Arthur Bell. Arthur accepted it. Do I need to sign? Daniel considered this. No. Excellent service. Daniel grinned. Arthur looked at the envelope. Who is it from? Me. Arthur smiled. Shouldn't you be getting ready for school? Daniel's eyes widened. Then he turned and ran. Goodbye, Mr. Bell. Arthur watched him disappear down the street. Then he looked at the letter in his hand. He carried it inside, sat beside the window, and opened it. The message was short. Dear Mr. Bell, Yesterday you said someone new will bring the letters now. But I think when I grow up, I might become a postman. Then I can bring them. Thank you for showing me how. From Daniel. Arthur sat very still. Then, slowly, he smiled. Outside his window, the village was waking. A new postman would soon walk the streets. Letters would continue arriving. Doors would continue opening. Lives would continue changing in ways the person carrying the envelope might never see. Arthur placed Daniel's letter beside Margaret's. Then he reached for another envelope from the wooden box. There were hundreds left to read. For the first time in his life, Arthur Bell was in no hurry. And perhaps that is where we should leave him tonight. Sitting beside the window of his quiet cottage, with a warm cup of tea, a box filled with 50 years of memories, and an entire morning with nowhere else he needed to be. For most of his life, Arthur believed he had simply carried letters. But every journey leaves something behind. A remembered kindness. A familiar face. A moment of hope arriving at exactly the right time. And sometimes, we never get to see what happens after we leave the door. But that does not mean the moment was small. A meaningful life is not always built from extraordinary things. Sometimes, it is built quietly. One morning at a time. One kindness at a time. One person. Simply showing up. Again. And again. And again. So as the morning light settles over Willowmere, and Arthur opens another letter, you can allow this story to fade gently into the distance. There is nowhere else you need to go tonight. Nothing else you need to finish. The day can wait until morning. For now, rest. Let the world become quiet. And remember, even the smallest kindness may travel much farther than you will ever know. Good night. And sleep well.